Shalom. The treasure of the Lord is just waiting to be discovered. So let's search for Jesus in the tabernacle as we turn once again to Exodus chapter 25. In verse 23, we read, "You shall make a table of acacia wood. 2 cubits shall be its length, a cubit its breadth, and a cubit and a half will be its height. You shall overlay it with pure gold and make a molding of gold around it. You shall make a rim around it a handbreadth wide, and a molding of gold around the rim. And you shall make for it 4 rings of gold, and fasten the rings to the 4 corners at its 4 legs. Close to the frame the rings shall lie as holders for the poles to carry the table. You shall make the poles of acacia wood, and overlay them with gold, and the table shall be carried with these. And you shall make its plates and dishes for incense, and its flagons and bowls with which to pour drink offerings. You shall make them of pure gold. And you shall set the bread of the presence on the table before me regularly." So, to refresh our memories, here is a depiction now of the tabernacle with all of its coverings removed, and now we are in the inner court, or also known as the holy place. So we're looking at the table of showbread, as is referred to in some translations, or the table of the bread of presence. It sits opposite of the lampstand, the menorah. So here we have the table of showbread seated here. We're going to be taking notice of when it's referred to as the table of the bread of the presence. What does that mean? Some of you may be more familiar and more comfortable with the table of showbread. But what exactly does that mean? In the Hebrew, we have this is the literal. It's the table of the bread of faces, the plural of face, panim. So we have this word panim also has the idea of presence, referring to God. It's the express presence of God among his people. So it's the bread that is set before the presence of God. There's an indication here for us in the book of Leviticus, chapter 24, more details regarding instructions concerning this table. In Leviticus 24, in verse 5, we read, "You shall take fine flour and bake 12 loaves from it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each loaf. And you shall set them in 2 piles, 6 in a pile." So that's the depiction that we have with these 2 piles of these loaves of bread. So they're to be on the table of pure gold before the Lord, so in his presence. "And you shall put pure frankincense on each pile, that it may go with the bread as a memorial portion, as a food offering to the Lord. Every Sabbath day, Aaron shall arrange it before the Lord regularly. It is from the people of Israel as a covenant forever. And it shall be for Aaron and his sons, and they shall eat it in a holy place, since it is for him a most holy portion out of the Lord's food offerings, a perpetual due." Every Sabbath, they are to replace or replenish these loaves of bread. So for 1 full week, these loaves would sit there. And because they're in the presence of God, they're not going to go stale or moldy, because God, in his presence, nothing can decay, nothing deteriorates in the presence of God. So he sustains all things, and this is a picture of the presence of Jesus amongst us, who sustains us by the very picture of this bread. Now, looking back at verse 5, "You shall take fine flour and bake 12 loaves from it," or depending upon your translation, it may say 12 cakes of bread. These are literally loaves, but it's the Hebrew word challah. And the word challah, it comes from a root word, halal, and we see that word spoken about in Isaiah chapter 53. We've seen it in the past, but we haven't connected it in this sense. Now, the challah bread literally means bread that is pierced. Now, if we go ahead to Isaiah chapter 53, we see that root word being used in reference to Jesus. Isaiah 53, we'll look at verse 4, and then we'll look at verse 5 as well. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. This is speaking of Jesus. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was, halal, for our transgressions. He was pierced. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. So this entire chapter of Isaiah 53 is speaking about the suffering servant, the one who would come, and for the people, for those who would put their trust in him, the Messiah is going to lay down his life and be raised again on the third day, as this entire chapter reveals to us, bears that out. So it prophesies about the coming Messiah, the one who would lay down his life and who would be raised from the dead also. But this verse 5 speaks about he was pierced for our transgressions. It's connected to that same word that this bread, this challah bread, is pierced bread. This bread that is placed before the presence of God is a pierced bread. Now, if we go ahead into the New Testament, I want us to see something in Matthew chapter 12. It's a Sabbath day, and Jesus and his disciples, they have plucked some heads of grain as they're walking through this field. And we read this: at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry. They began to pluck heads of grain and eat it. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." But Jesus said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God," this is referring to the tabernacle, "and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless?" So keep in mind that the temple replaced the tabernacle when Solomon built that structure, King David's son Solomon, when he became king. So Jesus says in verse 6, "I tell you, something greater than the temple is here." He's speaking about the temple was great, but that was a foreshadowing. The tabernacle was great, but it was a foreshadowing. And the foreshadowing is the one that is amongst them right then and there. And he's referring to himself, something greater than the temple. And he's referring to the fact that he is the one who is in their midst. He is greater than the temple itself. So this connection between the bread of the presence, the Sabbath, the rest that Jesus comes to give to us, the fulfillment that he is and that he brings to everyone who puts their trust in him. Well, he speaks of that more directly in the book of John, John chapter 6. Now, in this passage, Jesus, he has fed 5,000 men besides women and children with bread and fish. And it's interesting that what they collect afterwards is 12 baskets full of these remnants. So the 12 baskets, bringing us back then to those 12 loaves of bread that were in the presence or before the presence of God. Well, look what we see in chapter 6 of John and verse 48. He says, Jesus is saying, "I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die." He says, "I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh." So he's speaking about this foreshadowing of the bread of the presence. Jesus is the true bread of life who fulfills man, not just fills us like bread fills our stomach, but is only there for a time. But he more than fills us, he fulfills us. So that when we put our trust in him, that he is that bread who gives life, everlasting life, to all those who partake of this bread of the presence.